bookstore because of how much of certain editions you have, and they're so orderly.
That's funny because that's what my mom says, but she says it less kindly. She's like, "Oh, you could open a store." And I'm like, well, I could, I guess.
Hello, everybody. Today I'm joined by my friend Leanna, and we are going to pretty much just be gushing about Age of Madness by Joe Abercrombie. And I'm sure many of you know Leanna, especially in association with Abercrombie, as she is kind of the voice praising his works and has been for years. And we're going to get into spoilers right away. So if you haven't read the trilogy, then you might not want to watch. Yeah, go watch. Or go read, excuse me. You might not want to watch, go read it first. It was funny because I have general prompts and everything, and this first one, I was telling my husband Sean that I feel like the whole video could just be a discussion from this first point, which is what sets this series apart from other fantasy / grimdark fantasy stories.
Well, I mean, it's better than all of them. So.
And that's another thing, is it really will mostly be a gush session. So we will get around to criticisms. I don't know how
I'm sure if required, I can muster a criticism.
I have some things, but for the most part, I just thought it was amazing. But for you, with this question, what does set this apart for you?
Well, I've said this a lot, especially because, I mean, any like book, good or bad, is going to be different from others, unless it's literally plagiarism. So, but I think with Grimdark in particular, I think one of the things that sets it apart, that also is one of the things that I love so much about it, is that unlike 99% of Grimdark, or at least 99% of Grimdark that I have read, it's not concerned with like proving itself to be grimdark. It's like grimdark by accident. It's just like, well, if I tell a story in a realistic way that's kind of cynical, then it's just kind of like grimdark by default. I'm not like, oh, look how black leather and eyeliner and bloody this is, let me just have paragraphs of that. He's like not trying to prove to you that it's like grim. He's just kind of like, the world's kind of a bad place.
That's a good way to put it. I was going to say, I don't feel like he sensationalizes, or I don't think he is trying to shock you. That's probably a better way to put it. There's not an immense amount of shock value in this. There are certainly times where, because of how the plot twists and turns, that you might be shocked as a reader, but it's not like every other page there's some horrific thing occurring. To your point, there are horrific things that transpire within the book, but within the realm of real world possibilities, if not just things that have occurred throughout our own world, and thus it makes sense that it would transpire in this one also. Especially, I mean, just that part where the person is caught within the child is caught, I think it's a child that gets killed, and that's kind of where one of our characters finally gets pushed to be like, okay, yeah, we need to do something about this. But then it's like revolution pretty much right after that, and he's like, whoa, okay, this is getting really extreme. So, but something like that, these what I'm gonna mildly call workplace accidents, these are the kinds of things that are why so many people throughout history and even now are suffering and want to resist in some fashion, but there's just always the biases, we'll say, that are behind the scenes, keeping everything in a way that works for them.
Well, I think,
so
I was gonna say, like, it's like the cynical tone also, it's not happy, but it does keep it from being like an extremely depressing read. That's not to say it's not dark, and there are certainly moments like the child getting hurt that's like, well, let's hope you're not reading that gleefully. But like the tone overall, again, part of the whole not trying to prove itself to be super dark, it's not like, oh, the world is the darkest of places. It's more just kind of like, well, the world is kind of a bad place. And so since that's the tone of it, then I don't personally feel like that depressed reading it, even though there's some pretty harrowing content. Whereas other authors with like very similar like events, like similar like plot points, would just like write it in a way that would feel more like, oh, we're just gonna like wallow in the misery of this. Yeah. And Joe Abercrombie's kind of like, what'd you expect though? Like the world is bad.
Funny. It's funny. There's so many lines that are hilarious. Like he's in on it with you of like, look at these idiots, and I appreciate that. A line that gets me, I have a number of tabs throughout, and I will come back to this all the time because it's so stupid and it's so funny. When they're talking about Judge at the beginning of one of the books, and they're like, ugh, in the second book specifically. And it's this council of men that are talking about the judge, and they're basically saying like, oh, a judge, this judge woman, ugh. And then in the narrative, it says something like whether they were put off at the idea of a woman or this one in particular, it was hard to say. Those kinds of lines where it's like, yeah, they're all so stupid and so absurdly dumb. But when it's kind of like you look at your own political system, wherever you live, there's dumb politicians everywhere and there's just dumb people everywhere. And when you analyze that and you compare it to, it's basically satire of our own circumstances, which is great.
I mean, sometimes it's not even satire. I wish it was satire.
The part where they're trying to decide what their new government is going to look like, and they're like, what if we hold these truths to be self-evident? Everyone's like, that's the worst first line. And someone's like, how can it be self-evident? And they're arguing over that. And I'm like, well, that wasn't very subtle, but it was still really amusing. And the fact that they argue about like the point and how the point is worded, and then they just keep going about these specifics in such a nitpicky way that it never actually results in anything getting done. Where you're like,
which sounds a little bit like the stagnation in this legislature nowadays.
Right. The other part of this question, because we were kind of focused on the grimdark aspect, but just other fantasy stories in general, what do you think sets this one apart, since we are both such fangirls for it?
Well, I think it is like grimdark. I don't know if this is fair to say. It seems to me that grimdark is probably a little bit more like low fantasy, low magic just generally. But I think First Law is like the lowest that you can go and still be fantasy.
Without it being a fantasy that doesn't have magic, which people debate whether that even is fantasy. But as far as a fantasy that has magic in it,
I feel like at that point I would just call it like speculative fiction, because it's like, well, it's not our real world, it's something else, but there's like no magic to be seen.
Right. So you think that the fact that it has such a low magic system is part of what sets it apart?
Because it almost reads like historical fiction, because like cynical, like when people write, people do this with Game of Thrones as well, when they talk or like make fun of people who think that it's history, because like George R.R. Martin is a big history buff, so then he was inspired by like the War of the Roses and the Tudors. So like First Law has that kind of in common, and First Law is even less magic than A Song of Ice and Fire somehow. So it truly just reads like, I would almost forgive somebody reading First Law who was like, had never learned like global history or like global geography, had like just been in their little town and never seen anything outside of it, and we're reading this. If they thought this was just like history, like I wouldn't really blame them. Yeah.
I think, I know he gets praised a lot for his character work, especially in First Law itself, because the characters, not that we can discuss the differences between First Law and this, but for me, when I read First Law, it was the characters that really carried the story. And I don't think they carried it necessarily here, but they're still just as well done, if not better, in my opinion, in Age of Madness. And just his character work in general is so good. And for me, almost every single one of my favorites, I love the characters, or I at least feel really connected to them in some fashion. And in this, it's like almost all of them are pretty despicable. And yeah, I still absolutely love it, because I can't defend Savine. I can't really defend, Gunner Brood. Or do you say Broad or Brood? Because
then Stephen Pacey says Broad, so I say Broad.
Yeah, I say Broad. But Ricka, they say like Sticky Ricka in the audiobook, and I'm like, is it supposed to be Ricky? Because a lot of the things that make it seem like it's supposed to rhyme would tell me it should be
again. Stephen Pacey says Ricka, so I don't know. And I think when I interviewed Joe Abercrombie, I think he also said Ricka. So I don't know.
So he has this like it feels like it's trickery. But anyway, yeah, Ricka, Broad. So I can't really defend him either. I like him. I want to really love him, but I'm like, you're also making some pretty terrible decisions from time to time. And Vic is not the best when you're thinking about a lot of what she's doing, but yet you're like, but I understand them, and they're kind of a product of their world, but also you're like, should I understand that? Should I like them?
Like, I always make the joke, and it's only half a joke, that the real grimdark is the truths you learn about yourself along the way. But like, I also think this is kind of like part of the fact that the tone is extremely cynical and not this like, you know, like heavy metal hot topic of books, because
Yeah.
like it's not like villains doing evil, heinous, like this is the devil incarnate type stuff. They're just kind of like average people that are in a bad world that have like bad options. And so like you can't defend necessarily their choices, but he never writes characters where they're like, I want to do evil things today because that pleases me. I guess sometimes he has some like kind of characters that have like perverted tendencies or whatever, but they even then like they just kind of feel like people that are kind of like they have some like bad inclinations, they have bad options, they have a bad system, and they're just everything's kind of generally messy. And you're like, is not great, but like I kind of get how you got there. So
I think with Savine in particular, you expect the usual route that a fantasy story would go down, I find, is with someone like Savine after she's seen the horrors that she encounters in book one. She'd come away from it all and she would care about the people. And if anything, she's like, this makes me care even more about myself. I have to look out for me. And
I think there's
I
even a line where she thinks that to herself, or because she like she originally like to herself, she did like the New Year's resolution of like I'm gonna be a better person because this is just too much. And then she turns around and is like, you know what? What I'm gonna do is make sure I never have to see that again by putting my as much distance between me and horrors as possible.
yeah. So I think that aspect of it, while it's almost frustrating to read, you can't help but feel as though that is a pretty accurate assessment of a lot of actual human behavior. A lot of people, I think it's actually a rare person, and we strive for this. We should strive to see what is going on in the world, learn from it, and then take steps forward to be a better person, to be a better member of society, to have a better impact on the planet. But a lot of people come away from bad circumstances with the mindset of, well, nobody's going to look out for me, so I have to look out for me. And then they never care, or their family. It's like me and mine, and that's it.
Well, I think
And I,
also isn't there like an old adage that's like hurt people? That like if you've been hurt, you're probably gonna hurt others. That's usually how it goes, rather than you being like, oh, because I was hurt, then I will make sure that no one is ever hurt the way
yeah,
it's like that's not usually how it goes though.
right. Right. And I think that the fact that she does endure a lot of trauma. I think that the scene in book 1 in A Little Hatred where she is clawing tooth and nail to get away, even though you recognize cuz almost immediately she sees the children that are being mistreated and she's like, "Oh," and she's put off by it. And at first she's like, "Maybe we should do something." And then she's like, "Well, maybe, and she's kind of thinking about how she can just like swallow this moral conundrum and excuse it in her mind. Like she
It's a
very
little that when
quickly,
you find out that sweatshops and like children working at sweatshops are making your iPhone, and you're like, but I do want an iPhone.
right. And so she'll rationalize it even when it's right in front of her. And even though you're like, learn, come on, like become better, which in an Abercrombie book, you know better than for the characters to have shifts toward the
If
good.
they
But
change, it's only for the worse.
right. But despite that, when she's enduring these horrors, you're still kind of like, oh, well, I mean, I didn't want that to happen. You know what I mean? And it's weird how it causes these conflicting feelings in you. And there aren't too many other series that can make me feel like that. So I think for me, it's how it gets said all the time in talking about Abercrombie. Like he makes you like the unlikable characters. But it goes deeper than that. And so even though it's almost a cliche to say that at this point about his works, I feel like that's really what defines for me what sets this apart so strongly. Aside from, of course, the other things we already mentioned. Were there any other points that you wanted to have within this prompt?
Well, I think in general, like I guess this might make it sound like every other book in the world depresses me, which isn't really quite what I mean. But like, because like really, really grim, like death metal grim dark is depressing. But then I also weirdly find like very like happy and like heroic fantasy kind of depressing
Because
because
you
of what we
wish it
were
could
just
be.
yeah, because we were just talking about when you're like, oh, they see the horror and then they're like, this must be stopped. We must change. And then they do. And then they save the day. And you're like, well, I wish the real world was like that, back to reality where are the heroes? Where is Aragorn? Where is Gandalf? And so reading Abercrombie, like, it's not this like heavy, dark, everything is like horrible, like some grimdark is. But it's not this like heroic thing where I'm just like, dang, why isn't the world like that? So when I read first, I'm like, yeah, that's how the world is, and it just feels so cathartic to read that.
That makes sense. It almost feels as though you are actually not, because I think so often we look around like, is everybody seeing what I'm seeing? Do we
Yeah.
not all see how awful this is? And then you read Abercrombie's works and you're like, oh, he gets it. He knows how I feel about everything. And I think that's why a lot of people connect to it. And to your point there, I definitely find there are times where I get almost depressed when I finish something that I really loved because of this. Like, I enjoyed getting lost in this. I wish the world was like this. This inspires me, maybe personally, but I feel like, not that I'm trying to say, oh, I'm so much better than everybody else, but you're like, why can't everybody try to be like this?
Well, because I feel like Abercrombie almost answers that question for everybody. It's like, why is there such evil in the world? Why do we let such evil things happen? And then he shows you a story in which people that aren't like evil people, they just kind of like can't do much about it, or like that's like it's inconvenient to do much about it, or like, and you're like, oh yeah, that's why the world is an evil place, not just because there's like evil people constantly trying to make a horrible world. It's because a lot of little things kind of like come together to create actual horrors.
Right. To create chaos that everybody's just, there's that line that Baez has about how we're all just trying to figure out how we can profit off of all of this. Essentially, I don't know if he uses the word profit, but something along those lines, where we're just trying to pull what we can out of the situation.
I mean, I feel like
And
that in a nutshell is First Law, is the fact that the like evil dark mastermind behind this grimdark series is a banker, because this evil dark wizard was like, you know how I actually control the world and people? Money.
right. Yeah. And then, I mean, it's such a cliche to be like, money rules the world. Money is the root of all evil. And it's like, but it kind of is. So, yeah, I think it definitely showcases that really well. For you, who do you think is the most compelling character or characters if you can't pick one?
Well, I've often said that like the character that is not necessarily my favorite character in all of First Law, because that's Glocta, but the character that I most identify with like personally in all of First Law is Orso, who's in The Age of Madness.
Orso, no. Poor Orso.
I know. So I took that quite personally.
Yeah. That's interesting because as your friend, I don't know that if I were to assign a character to you, I would assign Orso because he's like a lovable idiot a little bit. Not quite Giselle, because Giselle, I'm like, you're so dumb. Like, Giselle's a himbo, right? Where Orso isn't that, but he's just bumbling about. He's actually kind of a good person in a bad world. And I think you're a good person in a bad world.
And that's nothing like you, Leona.
Yeah, you're, it's still up in the air. Jury's still out on this. No, I don't.
You do read
like that,
First Law a lot, which is a little bit concerning.
But he's just, I think, bumbling idiot is kind of a good way to put it. He's a lovable bumbling idiot, and I don't think that when I think you. So what do you think about Orso is so gripping for you?
Like, I really came to this conclusion in Trouble with Peace, because like his kind of being like nothing's ever expected of him, and so he doesn't do anything because he doesn't have to. And then when he's like suddenly put in a position where he has to like show up and like do like kind of hard and kind of like harrowing things, and he's like, oh, actually this is the most comfortable I've ever felt. Like, I actually really like having a lot of pressure on me. This feels kind of good. Yeah, I think I can do this. And like for like 30 years no one expected anything from him, and suddenly he's like put into a war and he's like, oh, I'm actually like kind of good at this if you like put like the pain of death on me. And like I feel that so keenly, because like I am often like, if you don't expect me to do something, if you don't ask me to do something, I will do nothing. But then if I'm like, I've like often been in like, not war, but like, you know, like like it was in a car crash where I totaled my car like halfway between NorCal and SoCal. So it was just like the middle of nowhere, and it was like it was like getting dark, and like they had to come tow my car, and I had to go spend the night in like some tiny little town off like the side of the road. And like when like the people came to pick up my car, I was like, okay, yeah, you know, we'll tow it there and I'll call the insurance, whatever. And they were like, you're taking this like really well. Like, are you good? And I was like, yeah, I mean, what are you gonna do? Car's totaled. So what are you gonna do? Like, I was just like, yeah, I just call the insurance, like get the tow truck, and then I go home. I just plan of action. But if I was like sitting around doing nothing, I would just have like existential dread spiraling constantly.
That's interesting because I definitely find I tend to be better at handling a lot of the really intense things. The things that you don't really have any control over, but you have to do it. And some
Yeah.
people don't handle that well at all. But I do it's not that I fret, but I allow myself to be irritated at all the little things. All the little things. Like if my AirDrop isn't working for even a minute, I'm just like, I hate technology. And I get really frustrated and upset about that. Why isn't the Wi-Fi working? And stuff like that. But then when something really serious happens, I feel like I jump into action. And
See that you identify with Orso too.
see, that's the thing. I don't know that I would have I don't know if I would have ever been like, "Oh, I identify with this character." There's a part of me that I feel like Gunner a little bit. I'm like, I mean, I like the idea of just not that I'm weird with like sort of getting turned on by violence and chaotic people, but I I'm not pulled in by that kind of stuff. But the other side of him of just like I just want to have this nice, relaxing, cozy life with my spouse and my child, that kind of thing. And I'm just like, I just want my cozy life with my husband and my dog. So I think in a way I felt for him.
Mhm.
And it was the hardest, I think, for me to accept his faults
Mhm.
because his faults are present. But I'm like, but I feel like his heart is pure. Even when he's making the bad decisions, you're like, okay, but he's making the bad decisions though.
He's a
So
little
I
bit like
think
an heir to Logan in this series, I feel like.
yeah, Logan to me was a little different, but I do think that there are similarities between those characters. I found that line about Savine saying like, "Oh, her father said everybody always," or it was something like, "Did she actually marry her father?" Like everybody repeats the same thing, the same cycles. And in a sense, I feel like you could assign a lot of these characters to characters from First Law. I mean, it's a pretty obvious statement, probably, but I do think there's some truth to that.
Well, some of
But
it's intentional, like Leo's metamorphosis into Glocta, like the moment he gets crippled, I was like, "Oh, are we
right.
doing this?"
Well, and it's funny okay, so one thing I really appreciated, this could be a whole prompt, but one thing I really appreciated was the way he basically tells you everybody's end because he foreshadows the hanging by Orso. Literally, the first scene of Orso is him being like, I hate hangings. And
Yep.
he thinks it all the time. And then that happens. And then Leo, for a whole book, it's just like, oh, this leg, oh, this leg, oh, this leg. And you're like, oh, well, now he lost one.
But
He's constantly
also
telling you.
Orso's last words, "How's the leg?"
I hated Orso when I first met him. I hated him. I hated him. And then by the end, I'm like, no, he is so mean because the whole book he's doing nothing. The whole book, you're like, get away, get away, get away. And then in the end, he doesn't. You're like, well, what the heck? Which is every Abercrombie. I'm like, I know it's gonna come. So there is a little part of me, I guess if we're gonna jump around a bit and talk about criticisms. If there is a criticism, it's that you always know that he's never actually going to give you the thing that you want as a reader. That, like, oh, I hope these two get together, or I hope this person has success. Like all those things that readers have a tendency to
Well, I
want.
mean, the one time he actually gives you a couple that you kind of actually want to root for, you're like, "But they're brother and sister." Why would you do this?
I want to come back to that in a second for a number of reasons, of course, but there's one in particular I feel like is a slightly different angle of that. But yeah, I just find that because you always know that he's going to present something to you that you want and then he's going to take it away. There's a couple of times that certain things are a little predictable. Like Orso's death really hit me and it really gutted me, but I was like, I mean, it's Abercrombie though,
But
it's not
that again, as like a
surprising.
quick example of like the way, because he doesn't belabor the point, because he doesn't exaggerate the tragedy of it, because he's so like simple about it, where he just kind of does it, and his last line isn't like, "Oh, my life was a waste. If only I had to," like blah blah. Like some author would have like 3 pages of like a farewell speech from Orso, but instead the fact that he's like, "How's the leg?" and that's it. I was like, "Oh, I'm crying so much more." For that.
I remember I'm always gonna know where I was when I read that moment. Or so I want to know how everybody else feels about it. It to me it might be the saddest moment of all of his works.
I mean, it's the
All of his
first time
works
I ever
combined.
cried reading an Abercrombie book.
Really. It was funny because I did do kind of a
He killed me.
non-spoiler. He did, yeah. That's why you're taking it personally because everybody's secretly selfish. Um, I did kind of a read through of the first book, and I made it where it was non-spoiler, but I was discussing like my non-spoiler reactions as I was reading. So somebody was like, "Oh man, when you talked about how you hated Orso at first, I was like, no, he's my favorite." And by the end of the first book, I didn't hate him, but I was like, "Orso's your favorite?" You know, like I was like, "Really?" I mean, he's all right, but and now I'm like, "Oh, I understand." Because if I had to go back and see somebody being like, "I hate Orso," I'd be like, "Don't say it. You don't know what's gonna happen to him. He does try."
Well, I think again, I identify so strong with him just because like because of that, the fact that because he on his own, he wouldn't like try to do something, and therefore people like basically told him that he was incapable and made him believe that, and then it turns out he's actually extremely capable. He just kind of has to have pressure put on him, and like that's very much like was my life experience of like because I won't like take the initiative to do something, but if like I'm put, you know, in a situation that's like demands a lot of me, I will like rise to the occasion. But because like I didn't initiate it, no one ever put me in the occasion. And so they're like, "Oh, well then she won't be able to handle it." But then I can handle it. I'm actually way better off under pressure. And so then like seeing that, I just like never read a book where I saw a character like that I was like, "Oh yeah, like that's like me. Yes, I understand this. I've never seen a character that's like that." Yeah.
He is different than most. I mean, back to our point about like what sets it apart. I don't see too many characters done like these characters are, which leads me to I hate I hate Leo. I hate him. I can't remember the last time I hated a
Yep.
character so
It
much.
just gets worse and worse.
It's worse and worse, which there's clues along the way. I mean, like, as soon as there's a line where he's like, "There's sure a lot of brown faces around." I tabbed that because I'm like, big red
I mean,
flag,
he
you know?
seems like he's gonna be like a Giselle type at first, where he's like, you're kind of like a pretty dumb guy who's a bit like cocky, but like that's you're gonna be like harmless, but like kind of annoying. And then you're like, oh.
Yes. This is what happens when you hand a really dumb man a bunch of, it could be a woman too, he just happens to be a guy, but when you hand a dumb man who has a lot of privilege and a lot of people that are hyping him up, when you hand him positions of power, or you give him a taste of it and he doesn't want to let it go, because even the fact that when he was like, "Wait a second, so you and Orso are actually, but that means that your child has got a claim to the throne," she's kind of like, he doesn't seem very concerned about the fact that we did stuff and we're related. And he's just always thinking about profit, profit. How can I gain
But it's also
something
like
from
really
this?
interesting to see. It's almost like one of those like the darkest timeline, you know, alternate versions of how things could have gone, because both Glokta and Leo were young men who were like extremely attractive and very good at like hand-to-hand combat, and both relied on both things to be like, I don't have to think, I don't have to be clever, I can get away with being hot and being like a really good fighter, and that's all I need to ever worry about. And then both of them got crippled, and like Leo still looks pretty good, but like they both had to like, I can't do that anymore. I have to like actually like use my brain now and I can't just like be the fighting man. And so in the case of Glokta, arguably it improved him. I mean, he's a torturer, but like we tend to
Right.
like Glokta. Whereas like Leo, it's like a very similar situation where like now he has to think, now he actually has to apply himself, which is what Savine was wishing for, and then was like, I can't believe I wished for that because this is so much worse than when he was just a himbo. Like, I
Yes.
can't believe I wished he was smarter because this is harder to manage. But like it's like the
What
same, yeah, path.
when she I know it's a little TMI, but the scene where after the children have been born and they're trying to be intimate again, she's like, "Ugh, I wish he would just let me take care of this. Like, I wish he would just let me be on top. It would be so much easier." But he's so prideful in every area. And you're just like, that's a perfect representation of like, just let her handle things. Okay. She's way better at it. Why do you even try? Just accept that you're dumb. That's what I needed him to do. Accept you're
But he's
dumb.
like
Other
just smart enough, because if he was a little dumber, we'd all be better off. But because he's just smart enough to what, like he actually does cause problems, like, and is clever
all the
enough to
problems.
see through her eventually and be like, oh, I see you're scheming and I don't like how you're scheming. I'm going to do my own thing. And you're like, ugh, you're too dumb to be good at this, but too smart to like
Yeah.
be able to be,
And
yeah.
he's the worst. He's the worst because even with Savine, it's kind of like if she dies, I mean, like you know, what I mean, he doesn't care as long as he gets to be the. He always has to be the hero, is
Yeah.
because he got a taste of that early, and then he didn't feel like it was enough because when he's like, all I got was a sword, and he's all upset that he's not getting recognition constantly, that people aren't having this fanfare for him all the time.
This is what happens when you give children participation awards. They turn into Leo.
All the time I'm like, just listen to your mom. Just listen to your mom.
Well, but then that too, in like the bedroom with him and Savine, that there's this kind of like, he's got mommy issues. Let's say that.
Yeah. I will say, the amount of times that I laughed at how oblivious he was to his attraction, that just immediately, I do wonder if anybody thinks it comes out of left field, because I'm like, it's definitely there the whole time. Because too,
I feel like, again, like when other authors will have like characters that are racist or that are bigoted in some way, and they'll just make them like evil and hateful and whatever, and like he is evil and hateful, but a lot of it is like self-hatred, and I feel like that doesn't get depicted that often. And the fact that Leo is so hateful because partly like he's just in denial, and it's self-hatred in actual fact, like that's what makes it so compelling. And you're like, oh, I know that guy, I've seen this.
Yep. The person that, it's like, okay, I know comedians are controversial, but there is a comedian that talks about how he gets so angry when he watches his wife get to be excited about things, because she'll be like, oh yay, it's like it's fall, I'm so excited to get pumpkins and she gets to show that excitement over these silly things, whereas when he goes to like get a pumpkin, he can't do it because he's like, I'm a man, my friends would make fun of me.
You know, there's
yeah.
I love Bill Burr.
I didn't hide that very well. But I mean, I know he has some things some bits I'm like, but other ones I'm like, I mean,
for the most part, Bill Burr is pretty unproblematic.
he's reflecting in that particular joke in a lot of ways what I think this character represents, that like, I'm so angry because I don't get to live the way I like actually want to live, and I'm going to project onto others. And oh shoot, I was gonna say something. Oh, I know what it was. In reference to how it's very clear from the beginning when he's talking about he's not talking about it, it's in the narration, but he's thinking of all his friends, and he's just like, well, so and so was strapping, and this one had a beard, but like beards were, and he just like lists all the ways that every masculine feature of his friends are all great, and he's like, they should stand for a portrait because they are all so good looking. And I'm like, I think maybe he likes his friends as more than friends. And anyway, I was really amused by that. And then the fact that he like loves when Savine, well, maybe not loves, but he enjoys when she's like smacking him and stuff. Fun.
Yep. Well, yeah, it reminds me of all those memes that are like historians reading about like queer people back in the day that are like, oh, they were just very good friends. They were the best of friends. They lived together because they were the best of friends. You're like, okay.
Yeah. I still hated him. And I think that it is, well, yeah, that's basically, I just hate him.
Yeah,
he's the worst. He's the worst. Can you think of a character you hate more than this character?
Lysander in Red Rising. But there are like, it depends on the day which one I hate more. Because, Orso is me. Lysander hasn't killed me. So I guess that makes Leo worse.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's more recent for me. So he's fresh in my mind. And I wanted to add as well to what you were saying about how he's just smart enough, or he says or does things that maybe he's not even realizing are appealing. Like, he's not trying to be this mastermind who's molding everybody around what he wants them to think of himself. He just says stuff that works out. And all the times where he's like
failing upward.
Yes, that's the perfect way to put it. When it's him being like, oh, I am gonna drop this from my name because I'm like the people or whatever, and everybody's like, yes, he's one of us. And it's like watching, it reminds me of on Parks and Rec, when, for hopefully people know these references, but when Paul Rudd's character is like, I'm against crime and I'm not afraid to say it, and everybody's like, wow. And they're like, wait, what? That's all it takes. He's like, if that character was also very hateful. Like, he's such a dummy who ends up appealing to a lot of people, but he's also filled with rage internly. And he needs that congratulations all the time.
Therapy. They all need therapy.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump to some criticisms for a bit. Take a break from all the gushing. if you had to give a criticism, or if there's one you can think of right now, and not just you could see other people wouldn't like this, but you genuinely are like, if I had to say one thing I don't love, it would be this. What do you think that would be?
I mean, did Orso need to die?
Do you want me to go first? Because I mean, I agree with that. Did Orso need to die? But I don't know if I would say it's a criticism. I do think for me personally, what we were talking about with how he gives you what you want and then he takes it away, that kind of thing. I was saying how it makes it slightly predictable. I do think his action scenes, while well written, sometimes last quite a long time. And I find that he has a tendency to give you, sometimes it's like you get what you want within the action scene, but then right after is when you're like, yeah, triumphant moment. And then immediately something next happens that you're like, oh, are you serious?
Dang
like,
it.
Yeah, like when they're kind of like Judge, they're on that tower and then like they defeat Judge and you're like, yeah, and all that's happening. And then dumb Leo comes in and you're like, no, what are you doing? That made me so mad. But I do find that he does that a decent amount of times to where it then makes me not weirdly as engaged in the action. Cause then I'm like, okay, but I know
it's like predictable at that point.
Well, you're like, okay, I just want to get almost past the action to the part that's gonna ruin me because I know it's coming after.
I'm not getting invested in this moment because I know you're gonna take it away.
Yes, in a sense. So I suppose that is a criticism of mine. And sometimes I'll add as well, I loved the little people chapters. I do think maybe he used it just a few too many times, or he might have gone to too many perspectives within those over the course of the entire trilogy. Certain times it was perfect, just the right amount. And I especially loved the one where it was everybody gathering and to see
the
these
demonstration.
Yes, I loved that one. I loved the one in the first book. And the third book, the battle, the one that's kind of like with Rika and all of them, I'm kind of like, I don't really care about this as much because it almost feels reminiscent of the first trilogy where you're like, I feel like I'm just reading from the Northmen again, that kind of thing, which is, again,
I've always felt like the Northmen are like the weakest point of all of the books for me. Like people often say like in the first trilogy that that's their favorite part or their favorite character is the Dogman. And I'm like, it's first law. So like, I think all of it's like pretty good, but like the Northmen to me are like indistinguishable from each other. They're just kind of like the Northman is a character. And so I for here, like Rika was actually like Rika, Shivers, and Isern were like distinct characters that I enjoyed following. But like, like Dogman's death, I was sad for Rika, but like I personally don't actually care that the Dogman is dead. Like,
right.
I feel nothing.
I think that makes sense. Rika, let's go back to the characters now. I don't feel like you really answered the criticism question, so I'm going to come back to it. But
I'll think of one.
Okay, so with Rika, I feel kind of dumb. I will admit, I don't mind, like, how did I not realize that? I feel kind of dumb that I didn't realize she was going to cross Leo in the second book. I'm like, oh, that was her. I feel like that was an obvious reveal. Why did I not get it? But I was just like, oh, dang. I knew in the other part where she was pretending to argue with, I'm forgetting the guy's name, but the guy that she likes to hook up with in the North. What was his name? I'm forgetting now. Do you know who I'm talking about though?
There's that other to hook up with?
Yeah, there was that other guy whose father is.
Oh, I totally forgot about that guy.
So she pretends to have an argument with him. Like a chapter starts and they're yelling at each other. And it turns out it was all for show. So it would look like she's losing all her allies. I'm like, okay, I know what she's doing here. But when she betrays Leo, I did not, for whatever reason, predict that. Did you predict that? Were you like, yeah,
no.
Oh, you did? Because that makes me feel better.
Well, also, I think the thing with Rika too was that you were constantly like, is this even really happening in the present moment? The thing that you're seeing, because like I think it did a really good job of like conveying the disorientation of like she herself. Like no matter how many times he did it, when we would end a scene and Rika was like, oh, this hasn't happened yet. Like every time I was like, you got me again. I should have known this time, but you got me.
Her betrayal of Orso, I was like, no, just take him and hide him. I know that's not what makes the most sense, but I want you to do it anyway. That was heartbreak. I'm like, I can fault her, but I don't fault her. It's all Leo's fault. It's still all Leo's fault. Leo could just pardon him. Everything's Leo's fault. But I feel like that was done so well as far as showing the way that, you know, these people in power, if they really want to hold power and do what they think is best, because Rika is ultimately trying to do what's best for her people. She's like actually kind of a good ruler. She's the only one that's a good ruler, to be honest. And she's
in a
having
time
to
of peace, Orso would be a good ruler.
Yeah. Well, but would he? Because he needs that pressure put on him.
In a time of more peace.
He's
not
just
complete peace, just more peace.
He's too forgiving. And like that's the thing is I'm like, dude, Leo,
Well, that's the thing. If Orso had been able to marry Savine and the two of them reigned together, that would have been perfect.
Okay, here's one question I have for you.
Because actually, no, you said this is all Leo's fault. It's actually all Savine's fault. Because if she had just told Orso the truth and not gone off with Leo and not decided to foment rebellion and like contribute her much superior intellect to make it actually a successful rebellion, it's her fault.
Well, okay, a criticism potentially. So Savine, we know, is willing to lie about everything. But when it comes to being like, oh, but like I heard a rumor about Orso, she's always like, and then just like kind of freezes up. And I'm like, just lie. It's not outside your character. Why do you never just go, that's just rumor because people are trying to damage my reputation? Like, say something along those lines, because can they prove it? It's not like she's sitting here thinking, I'm afraid that then they'll follow my mother and then they'll get my family involved. Like, it's not, she, half the time she's like, maybe my dad would be better off dead, my adoptive dad. You know, she doesn't seem like she's that
also
concerned.
When she finds out and she is so mean to Glokta, that also broke my heart because I was like, he raised you and he raised you well. If you had been raised by your real dad, you'd be dumb. Dumber than a box of rocks. You be grateful to Glokta.
I know. And well, yeah, we'll get to Glokta and everything at the end. But her not just being like, no, that's a lie, that's a rumor. I don't really understand why she never even attempted to put that rumor out, you know, to try to.
Okay, I have a criticism. I would say, like, I think it's better in this than in most other books, but I do generally hate when like the drama is like basically 100% caused by miscommunication. And like that's kind of what happened here. And like that, I mean, that does happen in real life. So like I can't totally fault a book for like ever doing that. You know, sometimes people do let out a breath that they didn't know they were holding. Like it does happen. Yeah. So, but like it's just like in worse books, it feels like utterly contrived and stupid. And in a better book like this one, it's more frustrating than stupid because you're like, this could be solved so easily by one conversation. And so like I do tend to hate like that being the thing though, because then you're just like, it makes, I don't know, it can add to the tragedy of it because you're like, oh, this was so easily preventable, if only. But then also it is a little bit annoying because you're like, then you have to continue to invent reasons in the story for why they still are not saying whatever it is. And so like they had to put distance, like physical distance between these people to make it slightly more believable that they wouldn't communicate. But yeah, it just seemed like, especially for someone like Savine, like less so someone like Orso maybe or Leo, but Savine's a pretty good communicator, or at least like a savvy one, and so she could have communicated more effectively.
Yeah. Do you think that her children were his children, or do you think they were Leo's?
I mean, I think it ultimately doesn't really matter. I think they're probably Leo's.
You think so? Because they're described as having dark hair, right?
I don't remember.
I thought there was a moment where it said they had dark hair, and I'm like, because Leo's like the golden boy, so it feels a little less. But like him.
Orso is also, I think, fair-haired.
Is he? I thought he had dark hair, but his father, Giselle has blonde hair,
and Therese also has blonde hair, I think.
Yeah, and like you said, it doesn't really ultimately matter, but. Because obviously,
speaking of children and whose parents they are, one of my favorite things was Jappo and the fact he's clearly Shiver's son.
Oh, I don't think I was paying attention. I feel stupid now. Refresh me on this.
Because Jappo is Monza's son, And when they go to meet him,
Oh.
I think either Orso or Leo, I think it's Orso, is like, I didn't expect him to look so like pale, like a Northman, because he's like from Styria. And you're like, that's because he's Shiver's son, obviously.
I think I like did not even think about the character from that. And so, because I was sitting there like, I kept expecting her to show up. So I don't
Oh,
even think I
Monza.
thought of, yeah, I was like, is Monza going to show up at all? And I don't think I thought about her son being in I feel stupid now that I
Well, when
didn't.
we were talking, I was actually going to bring up Jappo earlier when we were talking about Orso versus Leo, because that's again one of my favorite moments that like so clearly like
Yes.
juxtaposes them is
Their
Jappo's
interaction.
reaction to both of them, where he's like, I thought you would be more like this, and I thought you would be more like this.
Yes. Orso's that whole exchange was great, especially because, you know, Leo is clearly actually kind of enjoying deep down what he's seeing, but he's like so upset about it or whatever. So then it's causing him to just like get angry. And then Orso's just like just as laid back and just like, well, all right, let's just have a chat, you know. That is such a great moment. And I think
And
you're
Orso
right,
is
it was
actually more intelligent than Leo. He just never has to do anything. But he's the
yeah.
pampered prince. And so then Jappo's like, oh, you're going to be the pampered prince that I can't have a substantive conversation with. And the other guy is going to be like the man of action. But the man of action is the like pearl clutching idiot. And Orso is like, yeah, we can have a savvy conversation about politics. Yeah, I'm with you.
I now feel kind of stupid that I didn't even think about him being her son. I mean, I knew at the end of that book that I'm like, well, yeah, that's, you know, but I don't know why I didn't during that moment. I think because I waited so. Did you read them a little closer together?
Like the
Best Served Cold
standalones too.
into
I mean, not
this.
originally, but like, I think had I done another reread before Trouble? I mean, I definitely reread A Little Hatred before Trouble with Beast came out. I might have done like a full reread. I don't. I reread them all the time. So
It's been a while since I read Best Served Cold, so I didn't remember that as much, but
I mean, and to a counterpoint of like, he never gives you like the thing that you want. Like he slips little things like that in there to be like, well, that's Shiver's son. There you go.
I mean, that remind me though, us talking about, you know, how he puts something in front of you and he takes away. It's so weird when any author can make you be like, but I know they're brother and sister, but it's like you
once
so
again, the
gross.
real grimdark is the truths you learn about yourself along the way. You're like, am I rooting for
this? Yes, that's a perfect way to put it. But it reminds me, I guess, Best Served Cold. Hold on, let me say spoiler for in case somebody.
You're supposed to read them in publication order, so anyone
little spoiler for Best Served Cold, but that the way he writes the scene where you want the two characters to be with each other, and it turns out they both, in their anger, went to other people, and you're like, oh, come on, you know, that part.
But he does a good job of tricking you, also.
Yeah. Okay. Spoiler over. But it's so fresh. It's so frustrating that he does that. Okay. So are there any other character things that you want to talk about? That's the problem, is there's so much that we could talk about with this.
Well, I do think, like, I think it was just interesting to see like which direction he wanted to go in terms of like, so the characters that are the children of previous characters, are they, how similar, or are they going to be the same or the exact opposite or kind of the same? And kind of, so like, so the fact that Savine, like, is she going to be a carbon copy of Glocta, who raised her, a carbon copy of Giselle, who's her like biological father? Is Orso going to be a carbon copy of just like, is Rika going to be just like the dog man? Like, how much and how little to kind of like echo their parents but not make them their parents. And I think he like struck that balance really well.
Yes, I agree completely. I think I'm very picky about continuations because I often get really upset. I mean, you know, with Red Rising, the continuation after the first book, I was like, I don't want it anymore. And we even went to Howler Fest together, and I was like, I can't do it after that first book. But Iron Gold specifically is the one I'm talking about. But I loved this continuation in part because of what you just described. And I think he had not just what you're saying, but he had the right amount of incorporating things from the previous, incorporating previous characters, having certain thematic things tie over. I thought he did that seamlessly, whereas other times, I mean, it's not always a bad thing if continuations, they're hundreds of years later or something like that. But I found that if you're gonna do a continuation, I'm like, this is how I want.
Well,
And I
also like
actually,
having like the legacy characters not like overshadow the new
yeah,
characters. Like it's their story now, like to pass the torch to them. So like they're around, like Locked is there, Giselle's around, Dogman's there, Shivers is there, but like it's very much like not their story. They're there to as like a
yeah,
supporting cast. It is the new character's story. It is their generation now.
right. And I find a lot of times when that happens, I tend to be like, but I just want to go back to those characters though. And I didn't really feel like that in this. I think he weaned you off of them at a good pace because he definitely gave you more of the characters in the first book and then kind of slowly transitioned to having them
Well,
less,
he
which I think
actually
was
pointed
smart.
something out that I had not really like thought about it in like those terms before until he kind of like specified or like phrased it this way was that like in the original trilogy the characters, pretty much all of the characters, are kind of isolated. They're kind of divorced from any kind of like a family unit. They don't have people. And the new books, they almost all have like a family unit. They almost all have like people around them. They're not loners. And so it's just like a very different dynamic with these characters because they come from a very different situation than the original trilogy. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's a good point.
I think that the most you get, as far as I can recall, I mean, obviously you have the fact that Artie has her brother, but they're West. They're siblings, so that's a
And
little
they
different because
haven't
they're both
seen
their
each
own.
other since like they were kids.
Yeah, and oh my gosh, when you find out, you okay. Speaking of characters that you're like they're actually good, and then you're like, oh wait, when you see his side, you're like, come on.
Yep.
But
No one
the
is safe.
what I was gonna say is the closest I find you get is like hearing about Glocta's mother and how
Mhm.
possessive she was of him and how she kept him even. That is one of my favorite moments of First Law is when you find out that West actually did try to visit him and his mother kept them away. And then Glocta kind of has this moment of like,
Oh.
oh, we are friends. You do
Yeah.
care about me. And you're like, oh no,
Which I
this
feel like
is
is kind
sad.
of why he takes more seriously the like job of looking after Artie because he's like, oh, my friend asked me to do this, and
Yeah.
now we'll
And
do a
he
good
loves her.
job. I mean, that's
um,
also helpful that she's like not terrified of him, and he's like, oh, I can have a conversation with you.
yeah. I was gonna ask you when I said I wanted to circle back around to the whole incest thing. Okay, so I'm not encouraging people necessarily to pick up Age of Madness without having read First Law, but I think it's possible. It's helpful to have some context here and there. But here's my question for you: if you had a friend that was like, you know what, I'm just gonna jump straight into Age of Madness, will you fill me in on what I need to know? Would
I
you
would
keep it
say
as
you are no friend of mine. Go back to read First Law.
okay? But if they did that though, would you tell them about Savine and Glocta, or not Glocta, Savine and Orso's parents? Or would you be like, I'm just gonna let them, because that is quite the like, wait, what? If you don't know, because we know. We know if we've read First Law, obviously we're like, well, wait, no, this
I
is
mean, that's
not
like the
great.
one part of the story where I think it would be kind of interesting, or I don't know if fun is the word, but like it would be a very different experience to be surprised by that. There's so many other things in Age of Madness that I just feel like you don't have proper context for that. And it's not like a big reveal like that. It's more like Baez. Like when they have the conversation at the end about like you don't understand like what an existential threat Baez is. Like if you've never read the First Law, you just be kind of like, okay, I
Yeah,
guess.
right.
What?
I think that's fair. That's the thing is I would tell, Sean, for example, I really want to read I think he is going to start with the original trilogy, but I'd be like, Bayaz is bad, Glocta is, I'd like fill him in on those characters, but then I'd be like, but do I tell him about Sabine and Orso? I kind of wouldn't want to because I haven't yet because I haven't decided. Because if he does jump straight in, I kind of want that to be a shocker. But as far as your point about what wouldn't have as much context, is I actually think the entire end of this trilogy with Glocta undermining Bayaz, that would come so out of left field that I think you would be like, what? Okay. I think you would be disappointed by that. I'm curious if you feel that way too.
Yeah, well, basically, I feel like so many like little things, like they would make sense. He gives you enough information to where you can like follow the story. So in that sense, you don't need to have read anything before. It's just like there's so many scenes where like the conversation that they're having, they are referencing things and nodding to things. Again, you don't need to
Yeah.
know what they're talking about, but like the scene goes from being one dimensional to being three dimensional if you have that context. And so it'll just like feel like a much more shallow reading experience if you don't have the historical context that he keeps like referencing.
Yeah. I think it's possible. I think it'd still be enjoyable.
Well, and then I also think while you've had a less good experience reading the Age of Madness trilogy, you've also forever ruined the experience of reading First Law because now the surprise of Baez and all of that like is ruined forever. So like
Yeah. Yeah, all the Age of Madness characters being like, "Oh, no, not Baez. Baez, he's the worst." You'd be like, "This guy that's like this, he seems fine."
Yeah.
So, I agree. It would kind of ruin it. But
and also Giselle being king is such a what at the end of First Law. So now you'd be like, oh yeah, well he's gonna be king.
That's the ultimate. And then also you'd be like, "Where's Logan though? Does Logan die?" And that would I think be. I like how he doesn't ever let us know. You know, there's a part of me that's like, but I like to believe he's alive. And he's like, well, feel free to believe that. I'm not going to take it away.
What I also love is reading Age of Madness and then going back and reading First Law because, like, when you first see Shivers and he's this young kid and he's like, I'm called Shivers because I strike fear into the hearts of people. And they're like, you're called Shivers because you were literally shivering from the cold. And you're like, shut up. And it's like, now that's actually true. Like, he, like,
turned into
it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, because, like, now he is the stuff of nightmares to everyone. And he actually, like, is, you know, oh my God, it Shivers.
He's weirdly one of my favorite. I feel like he's one of sounds weird because he's like that, but he's kind of pure in this.
Well, I love the like little family unit of Shivers, Isern, and Rika, where it's like Uncle Shivers and Aunt Isern and like plucky Rika. Like the three of them together bring me so much joy.
Rika, I did really enjoy the Rika Savine encounters because they're so opposite from each other, but they kind of both seem to respect each other instantly.
Well, they're also opposite. Like, it's kind of one of those, like, are they the opposite because of nature or nurture? Because, like, if Rika had been raised in the, like, political society that Savine was, she'd probably be a lot like Savine. And if Savine had been raised in the uppermost north, or she's surrounded by, like, the Northman warriors or whatever, she'd probably be a lot like Rika.
I did enjoy the way that she seems to pretty quickly be like, I feel like, because she knows Leo, just being like, I feel like that's Savine. That doesn't seem like him. He's too dumb. I was so annoyed at him with how quickly he dismissed the fact that the other individual was constantly threatening her. And he was like, this is like men's stuff, though. You have to get over that. And I'm like, you're such a loser.
He writes Leo so well because it's not, again, he doesn't ever make him do anything like evil, villainous. Like, I feel like an author that was trying to make you hate a character, would you'd be like, well, this is too much. Because he does all
like
these little
puppies or something.
Yeah, and instead he does all these little things we were like, oh, you're like a thorn in my shoe. Like, you're so annoying.
And that particular example of how he's so dismissive of pretty much the trauma that has been inflicted on Rika is very realistic to, I feel like, a lot of people who have expressed like, this person threatened to do this to me. This person was following me when I was walking home. And the way it's like, well, we talked man to man and it's like, it's fine. And you're like, oh, okay.
Like, I saw a reel of someone like saying that like someone had like followed them in their car while they were walking home and stalked them all the way to their door. And they're like, and I was so scared until I remembered not all men. And then I felt so much better as I walked up to my door.
I feel like that's, is it the man or the bear? You know, which one? That's what this feels like. Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of the heavier things and whatnot. Are there any moments that come to mind that are super funny to you?
Every moment with Clover, because Clover is hilarious.
Are there specific moments that you can think of? I know I mentioned the scene earlier with the council meeting and the judge, or they're like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, maybe. I did like when Savine was talking to that woman who had also recently gotten married, and she's like, I might myself be in a delicate position because of, she's talking about like resting or something, and Savine thinks, as far as she knew, nobody'd ever become pregnant via rest. I do find Savine's like snarkiness because she is like her father a lot in that outwardly she'll be so pleasant or whatever she needs to be for that moment, but internally she's like this idiot. It's not quite as obviously no italics internal monologue,
Well,
but
but I think with Savine, it also like I like it because it's also really representative of women constantly performing womanhood and being like, I'm expected to be pleasant and nice, even though I'm currently menstruating and I want to die. So like the fact that Savine is like that all the time because she's like to be political, she's also expected to be like the pretty and the like upbeat and charming young woman. And she's been raised by Glocta, so she also knows she's like much more aware than the average person of how bad people are and what they're actually up to. So she's like keyed into it and is more aware than most about how important it is to hide that she is keyed into it. So I think he does a pretty good job with that.
Maybe I'm actually like Savine. Because the amount of times in
Your fault
life
this war happened.
yeah, the amount of times in life that I'm just like I feel like it is I have you there's this one account I follow that takes old classic, paintings and such things and they tell you what it is in the caption, but in the post they'll put some kind of funny dialogue for that scene.
Yeah, I've seen
And
that.
okay, so one of them is like this lady talking to a guy and the guy's like, "So you consider people's feelings like all the time?" And they're like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Really? That sounds exhausting." And she's like, "It is." And I feel like it's a little bit Savine, a tiny bit of just like having to constantly because if you were to ask people, what do you think of Sabine? I think most people would be like, she's cutthroat, she's a snake. She like they'd have all these thoughts. But then if you only ever saw her when she's interacting with the people that she needs to, basically that presentation she gives at the end when she's, on trial, you would look at that and you'd be like, oh, she's actually like kind of a heroic character, this mother, the image that she ends up having with the people of like the mother of the people.
A
That would
carefully
be
crafted marketing campaign.
yes.
That one.
Yes, that I find it's interesting how that is so opposite of what you actually know her to be. And in the same way that Leo is like actually a complete moron, but people are like, he's one of us. Savine is actually like super cutthroat, but she gives the presentation of being
Well,
really
part of being
lovely.
cutthroat is knowing like how to perform not being that way.
And I think that she's written well. I mean, it's funny because I wonder, I'm like, do people hate Savine more than Leo? I feel like someone has to, right? Because
Well, in
she
general, like when the first book came out, and I think the people that feel this way like dropped off and didn't read on, but like there were reviews of A Little Hatred that were like, oh, I didn't know Abercrombie's writing YA now, talking about girls and their periods and like whatever, like what happened to this being grimdark. And it's like this book is just as grimdark, if not more so, than anything else in First Law.
also
Like what?
also I'm like, our first introduction of her and Orso is her being like, let me spit out into this wine cup. Pretty sure it's not YA. And then we also have the men constantly referencing their fruits
I know.
all the
I
time. And I'm
know.
like,
I was like,
wait,
so you're telling me that an author that always, with any character he's writing, is thinking to himself, what would it be like to be in their body, in this place, in this moment, in this situation? How would they feel? What would they say? And you're telling me that he did that with females as well as males, and that's a problem for you? Then I don't think First Law was ever for you at any
you're
point.
gatekeeping First Law. If you're a
Well, I
loser
mean,
and you're dumb, you
I've
don't get to like this series.
honestly, like I've seen people who talk about First Law in a way that I'm like, I mean, not that I'm the authority, I am the authority. But like you are actually the butt of the joke of First Law because they're like, oh, I love it because it's so metal, it's so like grim, it's so just like hard and violent, and I just love how like everything is just so like evil and violent. Like that's how they talk about it, and I'm like, oh yeah, I mean there is violence, there is that, but like
It's
he's
kind of
also
meta,
making
but
fun of you. If this is how you are reading it, like you're not getting it.
I think it's meta in the sense that it's a reflection. It's not actually really fiction in a sense. I mean, it is, but part of it is like, yeah, this is what it's like. The bankers rule, the wealthy rule. There's these secret people that nobody even knows, and they're the ones that are causing all these problems. In that sense, you're like, yeah, but it's not good because it's edgy. I feel like is the
But when
assessment
people talk
there.
about it as like just being like, oh, an edgelord's fantasy, I'm just like, did you read First Law?
I wouldn't agree with it being an edgelord's fantasy either. I feel that I suppose people can express, they can feel differently.
I mean, I
about the
guess if that's
series.
how they read First Law, I guess I can see why they would be genuinely surprised by how Little Hatred is written. But otherwise, I'm like, how is this different from anything he's ever written except for the fact that it's even better? Like,
I would be confused if somebody liked Leo. I think that would be my only
be
like
concerned.
what? Like not liked him as, wow, I've never read a character that was
Yeah, no.
so well written that was like
Just
this.
we're actually like, yeah, he's got the right idea.
Yeah, they're like, I like him because he really is just like one of the people,
He's
you know,
speaking
he's
the
down
truth.
to earth. He's a man's man. He likes to get rough. And I think
It's
that'd
kind
be
of like the author of Watchmen who like did not intend Rorschach to be like a
Alan
character
Moore.
that people were supposed to root for, but then they did. And he's like, no, 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 no. So like I think if people rooted for Leo, we'd be like, no, 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 no.
That's a nice transition because there is a new Watchmen adaptation coming out. And I did want to ask you, how successful do you think, not Watchmen, but you know, back to Age of Madness, how successful do you think it would be if adapted?
I think very. Oh, I did have a funny moment too, though. Is
Oh, okay.
in A Little Hatred, I think it is, when Orso is trying to get like resources, like are like troops and money, and he keeps being sent to the different departments because they're like, oh, if you need this, you need to talk to like the army, and the army is like, oh, if you need this, you need to talk to like the 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 treasury, and the treasury is like, oh no, if you want this you got to go talk to like the legislature, and like they're all just sending him around, and he's like, I'm sorry, does nobody able to help me with anything ever? Like, no wonder nothing ever gets done. I understand my father so much now.
I I do feel bad because I feel like he tried, and I actually think that how he managed that rebellion, I was like, I want you to crush him. I was so pumped when they won because I was like, is Abercrombie actually giving me what I want? And I have another funny moment from Orso, which is I feel like not that funny out of the context of the book. I'm not going to do it justice, but there's a part where a woman's like, you didn't win. We're gonna, you know, she's like yelling at him, and he's just like tired. He just shrugs and he's like, whatever. Like, and I love, or no, that's not what he says. Who cares? And I just like he ends up so quickly because I feel like this is what happens with pretty much anybody who tries their best is they so quickly, and going back to the scene you just referenced, they so quickly just get so tired of the shenanigans that they're just like, because he goes from being like kind of peppy to just being exasperated with it all.
It's like bureaucracy will crush anyone's spirit.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But I also think like because he doesn't have a good reputation, no one has ever thought much of Orso. So he doesn't really care if people don't think much of him. He just cares about like if he personally cares about doing something, then he doesn't really, it doesn't bother him if people think he's doing a bad job with it or that he gets like a bad reputation from it because he's used to that. Whereas like Leo has always had this like high reputation, and so he's so concerned about what his reputation is, and Orso just does not care. And
And
so then
it's
that's
so
kind of his strength, is that like he's able to just like be the bad guy if that's necessary. But
it's so frustrating because it's kind of showing the way in which your reputation is really all that matters. And in a sense, I feel like looking at
in
political
politics,
things in
yeah.
politics, yes, of course. In
On the
politics,
battlefield, it'll be whoever's actually better at using the sword.
in politics, it's often what people's actions are is not actually what people look at. They look at the reputation. And if they like the reputation, they're like, well, then that's my person. And then when you're like, okay, but let's look at what they've actually done. Because it's very
Well,
easy. And so Orso not caring, in a sense, is like kind of accidentally his downfall because you're like, if
that's why
everybody
him
loves
and
you,
Savine together, because she'd be like, oh, we need to market this the right way. He needs that piece.
I know. Why do they have to be related?
I know. Why couldn't she just be like, look, I need to level with you, we're brother and sister, but let's also get married and then not
Pretend.
procreate, because
Yeah.
but like we'd be a good team.
Yes. Yeah, it's so again, to your beginning statement of, it tells us a lot about ourselves. There's a part of them like, why did Artie have to burst her bubble? Why couldn't she let her believe it, Okay, let's go back. Let's go back to how successful would it be if adapted?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, all of the books, like, and I think I can see why. I mean, they're already in talks to do Best Served Cold as a movie, which makes sense as a starting point if you're not if you're testing the waters, if you're not fully committed to doing all of the, like, ideally you get someone to sign on, we're doing the whole thing, all, 9, 10 books if you count sharp ends, we're doing it all start to finish. That's great. But if you're like, let's see if people are interested in, Fester of Cold's a good place to start.
Yeah. I think it makes sense, especially because it's so contained and it has a little bit more of a plot, like a plot that is easy enough to get invested within.
It's the most like standalone-y of the standalones.
And I think you could have, I know everybody compares everything to Game of Thrones, but to your statements earlier at the beginning of our discussion about what sets it apart, and you were talking about how it's low magic, so much of why fantasy adaptations that are live action often don't work is because they look stupid. They look dumb. Any serious content that you're trying to have within it, you then have this like goofy looking magic, and you're like, well, this kind of makes it feel corny now. And you don't really have to worry about that too much. And the parts that are more fantastical, or I mean, honestly, some of it's more horror leaning. So that would be easy enough to incorporate. There's a lot of people that do great hair and makeup and costume design, things like that, where you could, and costume designs, especially in this one, I find in this trilogy, I think would be fantastic, is the way that they're kind of shifting into this different look for their clothing.
Well, and
their
if they're
hair.
trying to like escape from the, oh, you're making Game of Thrones part 2.0, I think this one like aesthetically is more distinct because it doesn't have that like vaguely medieval-esque like kind of look to it. It's the Industrial Revolution, and so you have like you don't see that kind of a setting very often in fantasy. It's usually more the Game of Thrones and First Law original trilogy.
Yeah, so I think in that way it would be set apart. But the low magic, I think, would really make it a lot easier to adapt. And on screen, there's just so many scenes that are just characters having conversations with other characters and trying to like allowing really fantastic actors to lead the charge, as opposed to feeling like you need to have all of these special effects and that you need to have these like giant landscapes and you have to be on set at this beautiful location that's really hard to film in because the weather is temperamental. It's like
they can put all their budget into the 2 scenes that require that.
yeah, and into the battles with like Orso and Leo on opposite ends or whatever, that one time pretty much, where like the north fight in book 3. But otherwise you just need like a city. You need a couple cities. Okay, yeah. I'm acting like it's so easy to make adaptations, which I don't mean to dismiss the hard work.
It's easier to make it like you'll need a substantial amount of money no matter what, but like it's easy for like speculative things to look silly and dumb because like it's not even necessarily the budget for it. It's often just kind of like not fully knowing how to make this look good, because like it's not, you don't have a real life reference point for it, so you're just kind of like, we'll just put lights and stuff. You're like,
I haven't watched it. I've just seen clips of it. Whoever was in charge of the new Godzilla movie, the Godzilla, what is it called? What is it? Something one? What is it?
I haven't seen it. Is it Godzilla Year One or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I feel so bad if there's a Godzilla fan out there and they're like, that's not what it's called. But oh my gosh, is it amazing?
And like
visually, it's incredible. And it was so much less money than most of our Marvel movies. Like, absurd. You should go. Do you watch Honest Trailers?
Yeah.
Okay. If you can, you should go watch the Honest Trailer for that. And I think it's in that I saw they like show a side by side of one of the Marvel budgets and then the budget for this movie. And because I remember I was watching the Honest Trailer and I'm like, dang, that actually looks really good.
But like this is like when we were comparing like Rings of Power and House of the Dragon when they were coming out at the same time, because Rings of Power has so much more money than House of the Dragon. And it's not, HBO is like no backwater show. Like they have money, but they're not spending the kind of money that Rings of Power is. And House of the Dragon looks so much better because it doesn't look like this like CGI uncanny valley like weirdness. It just looks like a grounded medieval town where there's medieval people, and then occasionally we splurge on a dragon. But mostly it's just people.
Yeah, and that's what's great about this is you don't even have to splurge on any dragons. You just need...
Every so often Baez explodes something, so you got to have the pyrotechnics department on that, but...
So I guess here's another potential criticism. It's not really, because I'm like, I feel like if I really thought about it, I'm sure it worked itself out. But Savine, when you discover that she had an eater as somebody beside her the whole time. And there is a part of me that's like, I'm surprised she let Savine get taken and then sent to basically her death to be executed. Because I'm like, I feel like that might have been the time to step in.
Wasn't that when she had gone to go and get her brothers, though?
Well, she's in the scene, I think, when they're about to arrest the both of them. And at first they're saying,
oh,
like,
you mean at the end that she gets taken then?
The second book.
Okay, yeah. I thought you meant when she like ends up in the factory and is like part of that. And I was like, no, she's not there. Like she's gone.
The end of the second book. Well, it's not the end because there's a decent amount still. But in the second book, before she goes to like judge is gonna execute her, or whatever, the guards show up and they're like, put a muzzle on her. I'm forgetting her assistant's name. Zuri.
Yeah.
They're like, put a muzzle on her. She's probably an eater. And she's like, basically, you know, Savine's kind of like, racist much, you know? And then
well,
so later, way later, when it's revealed in book 3 that Zuri is an eater, I'm kind of like,
okay, but this is another reason why I don't think you can read Age of Madness without reading the original trilogy, because you'd be like, what the heck is an eater? Why is this happening? What is this?
Yeah, that's another good, that would come so out of nowhere. And
does this happen in this world? Since when?
That scene where Glocta's just sitting back, like, just get behind me, Savine, let the eaters, you know, deal with this. And you're just like, it's written so well because it's so disturbing and you really feel it with her. Oh,
but also because you actually know what an eater is.
Yeah.
You'd be like,
yeah, because they really don't come up. You hear them referenced, but they don't really show up in this pretty much at all. And it is interesting that you don't really see like the Magi in this either. They're kind of out of the picture. So,
but weirdly, I think this is more magic forward than the original trilogy because of Rika, because of how much you see her long eye. Because like, there's no character that's a POV character in the original trilogy that's like a magic user. Yeah. And in here, Rika is a magic user, if you want to phrase it that way.
Am I dumb? That woman that Rika goes to see, am I supposed to know anything about that character?
Oh, she was like in the original trilogy. She was on what's his name's side, the guy, like the head of the Northmen, the one that's like what's his name? Bethod. She's like working for Bethod, and she like helps to enchant, I think, the Feared. But she's like working with him, and she's like the first time that when Logan and Baez are together, and like the messenger from, I think it's Bethod's son, shows up, he has her with him. And like Baez is like, oh, she's like doesn't even know how to do magic. And then they leave and he's like, okay, she does actually know how to do magic. I was downplaying that. She's actually pretty good.
Okay, because I was like, I feel like she's not totally out of nowhere, but I don't remember how she fits in. So I was like, I don't remember who this is, but I don't think it's that random.
Well, and Isern is the daughter of Crummachifail. The guy who's always, you know, he loves Logan Nine Fingers. He's like, Logan, you're beloved of the moon. And like, little Isern is actually in the original First Law trilogy. And he keeps calling her his son. And she like kicks him. And he's like, I'm your daughter. And he's like, yeah, there, little Isern.
See, this is why after reading this, I'm like, I kind of want to go back and read First Law. Because I feel like I'm going to have a lot more context for... Yeah. Interestingly, it's like you need to go First Law.
Shivers after you've seen Shivers in all of these later books, and then back to Baby Shivers. It's so wild.
Oh, I feel like even from Best Served Cold, feels very different.
Mm-hmm.
But oh shoot, there was something else here toward the end that I wanted to. I do want to say we've already been talking for a really long time. Great character. I feel like she's weirdly the most like tender-hearted character who's forced to do the most awful things, and I feel so bad for her.
I also loved how like Vic was like given like a similar choice to Glocta, and she turns it down. Like, yeah, it's not like it's inevitable. It's not like, oh, anyone placed in that situation is going to make the same choice. It's like, well, just like Leo is a bit different from Glocta. They didn't quite do the same thing in the same situation. Like we see how like when Glocta kind of lets this be like own him, and she's like, nah.
I feel like her and Orso needed to be friends because they both have like a little bit of optimism and hope. When she gets the little gleam in her eyes, like, is there a chance maybe things will get better? And you're like, don't do this to her. She's been through enough. I always feel really bad for her. Well, anyway, we have talked a lot. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Because I feel like we could just keep talking over and over again about how good this is. Were there
Just
any
chapter by
scenes?
chapter. This was great. This was great. This was great.
You're really in depth. Yeah, when I finished reading it, so I messaged you like immediately, and I'm like, well, no, that's not true. I waited a while before I messaged you. I had finished reading it, and I was like, I kind of want to talk to someone. I have no one to talk to about this. And I was like, maybe I can convince Sean to read it. And one of my friends was like, okay, I got to read First Law. And they're friends with Sean too. And they're like, Sean, we need to read First Law together. And then Sean's like, do I start with First Law? And I was like, it's probably best you do. And I'm like, oh, but they're not going to read the whole thing in like 2 weeks. I still can't talk. And so I went through a long phase of being like, I just want to talk to somebody. So then I messaged you and I was like, do you want to talk? Because it's so good. When I read the Orso scene, I was like, why is there no one here to comfort me or experience this with me? There's just so many moments that are fantastic, and this series is
even
so
though
good.
it was Abercrombie, my little heart was like, well, we didn't actually see him die. Maybe he's still alive. And then I finished the book. It's like, he's definitely not alive. He's definitely.
I know. I kept being like, maybe there's a chance like something happened because it was kind of closed off from the public. Maybe they'd like, but yeah, I was like,
maybe Hildy came in clutch one last time. Talk about useful.
Oh yeah, and how she's with Baez. Oh, that's the thing I wanted to end on is the end. Do you imagine he's gonna write more in this world because of the weird visions?
I don't think he can resist.
Is Baez gonna rule in the end over everything still? Because I know Glocta was trying to. I like when Savine's like, so you just replaced him, and he's just like, I mean, better me than him,
Like, is it in what material sense? Is it actually better? Looking at the world that's in smolder, so like, sure.
Glocta, I don't know about this plan of yours. And how Glocta very brushes aside, like, I knew you'd be fine. And she's like, I went through so much.
Because we see it through Savine's eyes, I do think it's a good moment to because you kind of, because you've read First Law, then when Glocta's like, no, you don't understand. Like, as bad as all this looks, I promise you, this is still better than Baez. And even though you've read First Law, and even though you've seen what Glocta has seen, you're like, at what point is it almost the same? When you're like, oh, at any cost, this is still better than, you're like, you can reach that point and then also cross over into no, you've gone so far. This is actually worse than the thing that you were trying to prevent.
Yeah. I definitely think that one of the biggest themes, I mean, I think this was a theme that I felt with the first book as well, which is that nothing ever really changes, which is a cliche. I mean, it's an obvious statement that even if
the great change,
even if the people in power are different, it doesn't actually really change anything for the little guy, if you will. And that person, even if they are an Orso where they want to do good, there are all these people surrounding them where they're going to hold that person in, and their goodness is not going to have a chance to thrive. So in that sense, I definitely think that theme translated to this as well, but in a way even more depressing, because Glocta, you want him to triumph over Baez, but then the way in which he accomplishes it, you're like, oh, well, to exactly what you were saying, you caused so much destruction and you ruined people's lives, if not just ended their lives, all so that you could say better me than Baez. What? And you get to that point and you're like, well, gosh, okay, so yeah, nothing matters, nothing's better. Yeah.
I guess Glocta's not immortal, so there's that.
He'll die eventually. What a nice way to end it, to be like, yeah, everything sucks. So anyway,
if there is a single happy ending for anybody in all of First Law, I still, even through to the end of this trilogy, Glocta and Artie is still that's who I'd want to be in this story.
Oh, actually, the fact that I didn't even address the fact that he's like, it was actually your mother's idea. And I'm just like, Artie? All right. Okay. So maybe she's the real person to fear.
Well, Artie's the one that got Leo to marry, Savine too. That ambush where the moms are like, so Leo, you're going to marry Savine now. He's like, what?
The one time he couldn't resist, you're like, no, don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah. So really what I'm hearing is women ruin everything, because it's all Artie's fault.
Confirmed.
Just kidding, of course. Yeah, this series is so good. It's great. I want everybody to read it. Well, not everybody. I'm thinking of like certain family members that I'm like, no, never pick it up, never pick it up. But it's great, and I think a lot of individuals who like the themes that are present in this would I don't know why I'm like pitching it as if the people who are watching this haven't read it.
But I think also because like both, I think you and I, because like I read it when it was coming out, but like when A Little Hatred was first announced, I was like, I will read it because it's First Law. But like, are we just doing more First Law because that'll sell? And so it'll be like probably better than most other books because it's, he's a good writer. So it'll be pretty good, but it'll just be like more same. Is there a story to tell? And then I read it. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. This is so good. Like, apologies. So like for anyone that's like, oh, like, do we need more First Law? Like, are we just having, it's like, no, it's actually really good.
Yeah. I think I would feel that maybe more if, and hopefully when, he writes another continuation. I think I would be really curious to see how he would do that, because what worked partially with the transition from these two is that sort of industrial revolution, the setting has changed. But I'm like, okay, but not enough time. If we still have the characters, some of them from this present, you can't have the setting change too much because not enough time will have passed to really transition this turn of the century feel. I mean, there's still interesting things you can do.
Well, I think with the way that this ended with that almost like Marvel post-credits scene of an ending, like it almost heralds like a return of magic in a sense that like he's never really written high fantasy before. It's all like we just said, it's extremely low magic. So if he comes back and it's like actually the resurgence of magic, like that would be very different from anything he's written before. It could
be. That's what I want now. That's what I want when he's done with the devils, whatever he's doing with that. Let's go back to this.
That's sweet because like, I thought like Red Country was like a little bit burnt out feeling, still good, but I was like, it's a little like, I feel like you're scraping the bottom of the barrel here. And then he went off and wrote Shattered Sea, which I don't think is that good. But he came back to First Law refreshed and wrote The Age of Madness. So I was like, okay, write the devils if you need to. Do what you got to do. And then write more First Law.
The only time that I think I'm going to be like, more, another continuation. So that's our rallying cry at the end of this very long discussion. This was so fun. Thank you for joining me. I have wanted to chat about this for a long time now.
Always ready to chat about First Law.
Yeah. And someday I will probably... Here's a criticism, okay? Here's my last final thing. Picking up anything after this was just basically a death sentence to that book, because after reading this, I'm like, well, nothing's gonna compare. So how dare it?
That's why in my Discord, when I'm like, well, I'm not currently enjoying the book that I'm reading because it's not First Law, so it's therefore I don't
that's what your shirt needs to say. I hate everything because it's not First Law.
Yeah. If it's not First Law, I don't want it.
Well, I always say it is so hard for anything to break into my all-time favorites, meaning completed series, right? My all-time favorite completed series. I've joked before, it pretty much doesn't change. There's no reason for me to do updates because it's always the same stuff. But this broke into it, and then it kind of upset me because I'm like, well, nothing's going to be as good probably for the rest of this year, probably 4 years to come. Why is nothing as good as this? And I get upset.
Well, just reading the trilogy, when I read A Little Hatred, I was like, oh, this isn't just like a lame continuation. This was actually really good. But can he continue that? Like, I don't know. And then I read Trouble, it was like, oh, this is better than A Little Hatred. Okay. But he probably peaked. He's probably not going to stick the landing. And then Wisdom of Rose was even better.
A Little Hatred was great. But for me, I like Trouble with Peace and the third one for me were both like, they felt like one. I think because I read them so close together. I mean, I read the whole trilogy close together, but something about books 2 and 3 for me were even better than book 1. I don't know if I can determine which I like more of those two because they just are so... I might like book 2 more. I don't know. I don't want to try to think about it.
I always like second books and trilogies the best. And I mean, Trouble with Peace is peak Orso, and he's not dead. So
there you go. And I liked the Rika betraying Leo and wondering what the heck was going to happen with Leo at the end. Like, oh, is he going to, it was great. It was so good. And I do think the action, when I was talking about before, of lasting too long, I think that was more present in the third book than the second. And, I felt the same about Last Argument of Kings. Yeah. I felt like some of the action at the end there maybe lasts a little too long.
I felt that more with Last Argument. I think he's like gotten tighter with that. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know anybody that comes to these series like, oh my gosh, the action scenes though, like they're
I
amazing.
think they're the same people that read these books because they're edgelord books. Those people.
Yeah, because the action scenes, like people actually get cut up and stuff.
Oh, it's so metal. It's awesome.
Anyway, I'm gonna actually have our outro now. This is a
Okay.
lot of fun. It was so great to chat. And I don't know, maybe when The Devils comes out, we'll have to buddy read it or something.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I'll
then-
definitely read it. And we'll see. Can you write something that's not first all that I like?
Yeah, probably. I imagine so.
I think at worst it'll be decent.
Yeah. Probably better than decent, but
Yeah. I was like,
yeah.
I don't think it'll be bad. I don't think there's a world in which it's a bad book.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that'll be fun. We'll have to look forward to that when it releases. And this was a lot of fun, even though this trilogy was upsetting to both of us.
I'll just go back to the blade itself with Sean and work your way through.
I will have fun watching the two of them read through. My friend and Sean, I'm going to have fun watching them make their way through and just being like, what do you think of these characters? What do you think is going to
Watch
happen?
them not piece together any of the clues.
Yeah, that'll be it. And I'll get to relive some of it too. So that'll be fun. Let us know if you've gotten to the end of this video, your thoughts, if there's anything you want to add, if there's funny moments that we didn't mention, all that stuff, let us know. But thanks so much for watching. I'll have Leanna's channel linked, so obviously go check her out if you have not. And we'll see you later. Bye.